usual, as you can probably tell from the title of the video, we're doing a mid-year check-in of my reading progress. Quick disclaimer, I am suffering from a cold right now, so I do have a slight shortness of breath, and there is a certain nasally quality to my voice. So whilst I will try to keep the cuts as unobtrusive as possible, I will be cutting out a lot of my breathing, a lot of sniffling, a lot of clearing of my throat. I'm hoping it will just add to the quality of the ASMR rather than take away from it. So just to set the bookish theme, my reading goal this year is 40, which I believe is maybe 5 more than last year's goal. Don't hold me to that. It is currently the beginning of August, the very beginning of August, not when I pop this up while I'm filming it, so not quite a mid-year catch-up, but there we are. And so far I have read 15 books, so for those of you that aren't aware by those numbers, we are over halfway through the year, and I'm definitely not halfway through my reading goal. However, I think after this year, I won't be setting another reading goal. I personally currently find the culture around reading goals a little bit toxic. There's a lot of discourse at the moment around whether people reading 20-30 books a month are lying, whether people reading one book a month or one book a year class as readers. It's a whole topic of conversation, but I think a reading goal is something personal to you, and other people shouldn't really have an opinion on that. However, I feel a pressure when I set a reading goal. I'm someone who used to read, 100 books a year, but since having my social life pick up, moving in with a partner, taking up things like aerial hoop and aerial pole and yoga, I have less time for that, and that is okay. But I still feel a pressure there when I don't meet the reading goal. And I think I enjoy it more when I don't have that pressure there. So I think after this year, I'm just going to discount any reading goals, and I'm just simply going to read. So, I don't know if you can see this. I know that all of this won't be in frame, but I have my 15 books here, and we're going to go through what they are, what I thought, and what I rated them. So let's get started. First up, we have Sunrise on the Reaping by Suzanne Collins. This is another Hunger Games prequel. This is the one that follows Haymitch's Hunger Games. I loved this book. I am a huge Hunger Games fan, I really am. But I particularly like this one in particular. Do you know, I don't think I read that this year. It's on my Goodreads list for this year, but I think that should have been on last year's. I've read 14 books this year so far, and this is not one of them. But I did give it a 5, just so that you know. So moving swiftly on. The actual first book that I read this year, I was technically reading from last year. This was on my Christmas TBR, if any of you watched that. And it's Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. I was really looking forward to reading this. I'd gotten this beautiful cloth cover from Waterstones with the big scissors on. It is quite a juicy book, and these editions do not have big writing on. However, some parts were a little bit of a slog. I enjoyed reading it. I really like the most recent film with Saoirse Ronan because I will watch her in genuinely anything. She's a ride or die for me. But there's a lot of filler in there, which is very cozy. It's lovely to read, but it goes on for a little bit. So I rated this 3 out of 5 stars. Next up, by Rikudan, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, we have Sympathy Tower Tokyo. This was quite a quick read for me, part of a slew of translations that I've been reading. This wasn't what I expected it to be. It was incredibly thought-provoking, quite high concept, and just really made you sit down and think on where you landed with this one. Quite deep, very thought-provoking. I really enjoyed this, very different to what I normally read. And I ended up giving this a 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, we have Strange Houses by Ugetsu. This is the second in his series, the first one being Strange Pictures. Ugetsu is a YouTuber. His channel centers very much around horror, which is a genre I frequently try and get into, but very few horror books have captured me. I really enjoyed this one. It's not that it wasn't as good as the first one, it's just that I find a sequel is it's always harder for a sequel to top its predecessor, because with the first of any series, it's the first of its kind, usually, unless it's a retelling. But it's the first time you've been in that world, or you've experienced that format, that genre, that plot line. And so everything feels all fresh and new, which adds a layer of enjoyment. But I love the layout of these books. I love the concept, and I like how everything fits together at the end. And so I gave this one a 3.5 out of 5. Now the next one I read was in this big compendium, this collector's edition, Time of the Twins, which is the first in this trilogy of Dragon barefoot. I adore that little gander, honestly. He's precious and needs to be protected at all costs. I struggled with this to begin with. Karaman is in a very different place physically, emotionally and mentally. He is an alcoholic, which did slightly trigger me. I have a past with someone who is/was a drug addict, so this was a struggle to start with. However, I pushed past that and it got much better. I'm not a big fan of timey-wimey stuff. I'm not. Marvel really lost me during the whole multiverse thing. Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness is one of my least favourite Marvel films. That's a conversation in and of itself. But this really kept me intrigued. I think Tasselhoff carried it for me. I understand that's not everyone's opinion, but he kept me going through this book. So in the end, I gave this a 3. The writing was greatly improved on the first trilogy of Dragonlance novels, but I was slightly less interested in the characters, with the exception of Tasselhoff. I will read any novel with an abundance of Tasselhoff. He carries this for me. Next up we have another Japanese translation. This one is Best Wishes from the Full Moon Coffee Shop by Mai Mochizuki. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. This has been translated by Jordan Taylor. Jordan Taylor. This is the second one. The first one, I believe, is just called The Full Moon Coffee Shop. And these are about a coffee shop that appears during a full moon. It is run by cats. It is run by cats who each represent a planet. We have Venus, Mercury, we have the moon. It's a really cozy story. I ate this up. I really did. It was just as good as the first one. I highly recommend these if you're wanting just a really wholesome, cozy read. Super low stakes. Just something that you can not turn your brain off for, but that you can really sink into and just relax into. For that reason, I did give this a 4.5. Now, moving on, we next have Stephen Fry's Heroes, which is a collection of stories based on Greek mythology. Greek mythology. I am a sucker, a genuine sucker for Greek mythology. I had read Mythos some years before and was slightly more reluctant to start this one because I was less interested in the sort of demigods, the heroes of Greek mythology, rather than the actual gods and goddesses of the mythology. However, I genuinely, thoroughly enjoyed this one. I still preferred Mythos, but there's still a heavy inclusion of the gods. But it was nice learning more about Hercules, Perseus, Theseus, Jason, who I knew very, very little of. And the way Stephen brings in a comedic element to these stories is quite genius. So I gave this a so that I had a basic knowledge of the story of the Iliad, ready for reading the Iliad by Homer, but specifically the Emily Wilson translation. I had read an article about Emily Wilson's translations, which immediately made me want to read it. I had attempted to read the Iliad once before, but it was during a time where it kept getting interrupted, and it was hard to follow because of that. So it was years and years ago that I last attempted it, and I thought I definitely needed to give this one a go. Not to mention the beautiful pages, these rough edges here, these rough cut edges. Absolutely beautiful. I know that there is some controversy and discourse around Emily Wilson's translation. The idea that it's the feminist version of the Iliad. However, having read her translator's notes and introduction, that's not what this is. I think it's simply, by the sounds of it, and bear in mind this is the only translation I've read, it seems more that this is just a much more honest and transparent translation. Changes like swapping the word servant for slave, because that's what they were. It sounds like throughout many of the translations of this book, a lot of the less flattering aspects of the story and the characters have been altered, given a more airbrushed look, shall we say, and written or translated more favourably, and this just feels like a more honest translation. And genuinely, just on the note of translations, I know I'm saying that word a lot, translations, the translator's note about the process of translating, fascinating. The work that is involved in translating what is essentially now a dead language. It just gave me a wealth of knowledge on something that I just didn't really have a concept of. The story itself, again, wonderful. I love these mythologies, and finally being able to read one of the quintessential origin texts of these characters. It was a long time coming, and I loved the journey. I loved the journey of the Iliad. I had no idea that this book is set 3 days before the fall of Troy. I knew the Trojan War went on for 10 years. I did not know that this book basically covers 5 days of those 10 years, and that most of the story is told through flashbacks, I suppose, or the characters recounting past events that have led to the point that this is set. Once again, as with the 4 books, or the 3 books that I read before this one, I also gave this 4 stars out of 5. Now, breaking that very Greek mythology heavy theme there, we're jumping back to Yugetsu. This is the 3rd installment of his series, Strange Buildings. Strange Buildings. This one is much more of a follow-on to the second one, and I enjoyed this one slightly less than the previous one and the first one. It felt a little too similar to the previous one, but I'm still loving the very unique format of these books. The way that it's individual stories that all have some link running through them that I can never guess and am always surprised by. It's more that they're just starting to feel slightly too similar to the previous ones. But I will continue reading any more that is brought out in this series, and I gave this one 3.5 out of 5. I've had to move my mic back slightly just to make sure I can get this one in shot. But I moved on then to The Northern Lights by Philip Pullman. The Northern Lights by Philip Pullman. The illustrated edition. Now again, I did mention this in a previous video. I can't remember, it might have been my Christmas one. I might have showcased them at some point. But I got the whole trilogy for Christmas, the illustrated editions. It's one of my favourite childhood series, and I very much enjoyed diving back in and experiencing the absolutely wonderful art by Chris Wormel. I was also rewatching the TV series. I'd seen seasons 1 and 2 previously, but hadn't seen season 3 yet. So my intention is to read the book and then watch its season. And this really is an absolutely stunning edition of the book. Just so beautiful. It's a really enchanting story if you haven't read it or watched the film or the series. Highly recommend it. And upon the reread, I still gave it 4.5 out of 5. That hasn't changed. I then went for a very different change of pace and genre to Leigh Bardugo's The Familiar. Leigh Bardugo. I've read many of Leigh Bardugo's books, and I was very intrigued by this one. It sounded like it was going to be a little darker than her previous books, a little more urban fantasy based rather than fully fantasy in completely different worlds, but was also going to be quite steeped in history. I think it worked beautifully. This was it was quite haunting, not in a horror kind of way, but in a lingering kind of way. I thought the magic system was so unique, and I say system, it's not even a magic system, but the way that it manifests in these characters, absolutely beautiful. Serious and historical themes that it touched on, again, was done beautifully. So for that reason, we're going back to our 4 out of 5 stars. 4 out of 5 stars. After The Familiar, I not say too much about this one for fear of spoiling the first, because genuinely the biggest part of this book is a huge spoiler. But I like the way the story's developing here. I like the change in pace, the drastic change of plot after the end of the first one, and the character development in this one. They're really starting to feel human, and we're watching them grow and deal with the changing of the world and themselves. However, for me, sequels do tend to suffer a little. So this one in particular gets 3.5 out of 5. Now, jumping back to what seems to have been the theme of the first half of this year, we have Stephen Fry's The Odyssey. Now, I have definitely mentioned this somewhere on this channel, but I am a huge fan of the musical album Epic. Epic the Musical. It is wonderful. It's written by Jorge. I can never remember his last name. I will pop it on screen somewhere. But he wrote and voiced / sang the Odysseus parts and Telemachus. If you haven't listened to it or aren't aware of it, just give it a try. It is a retelling of the Odyssey in musical form, not on stage or acted, but just sung. It's an album. Well, it's many albums on Spotify. Definitely look it up. So I definitely needed to read more about the Odyssey. Firstly, because I love to see what people have changed when it comes to adaptations. But once again, just to expand my Greek mythology knowledge. I knew the bare bones of Odysseus's travels, but not the details and the nitty-gritty. And Stephen Fry really is a dab hand at retelling these stories, again in a very concise, digestible, hilarious way that still conveys the feeling of the original myths and stories. It will come, I'm sure, as no surprise to anybody that I also gave this a 4 out of 5. So the last book that I've fully read this year, I will come to what I'm reading at the moment. You should probably be able to guess, knowing that I followed Stephen Fry's Troy with Homer's The Iliad, and it really shouldn't surprise you that I then read Homer's The Odyssey. I literally finished this the day before we went to go and see The Odyssey in cinema. Once again, Emily Wilson's translation was stunning. Stunning. So beautiful. So evocative. She conveyed the story perfectly for me. Once again, I was unaware that Homer had started the story partway through the story. So Odysseus is already on Calypso's island when we join him, and then a big portion is retold once he gets to a certain point in his journey. Twins trilogy, War of the Twins. You can see my little bookmark. Now this series I'm actually co-reading with my partner. We take it in turns most nights to read a chapter each out loud to each other. So that we're specifically reading at night time. Because of this, I need something to read in the day. So one of the other books I'm currently reading is the third in the His Dark Materials series. His Dark Materials, the Amber Spyglass. However, as you can probably tell, this is not a very portable book. It's also quite thick, so I need a book to read when I'm out of the house. Which leads me to my third current read at the moment, Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. This, along with the 3 His Dark Materials books, is a reread. Though I think to say that this will only be 4 books I've reread so far this year is very good going for me. All of the books on these shelves are books I've already read and I'm desperate to reread. So I think I'm doing quite well to get through my TBR rather than reread every book on this shelf. But I have recently watched the first 2 seasons of Interview with the Vampire. Interview with the Vampire. And so I wanted to give the book a reread to see how faithful the show was to the book. So far, fairly faithful. I'm a huge fan of the film with Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise, and not long after watching that for the second time was when I first read this book. And of the things that they took from the book, I remember being very faithful. The show definitely changes some things, particularly Louis' origins, obviously his race and therefore his history, but also the relationship between him and Lestat is quite different to in the book. But pretty much everything else seems to be following it fairly closely so far. So there you have it, my mid-year reading check-in. 14 books so far, not 15, and 3 that I'm currently reading. I'm quite conscious of how dark it's gotten since I started this video, so I do apologise about that. I realised about halfway through that the light was shifting, but realised how disorientating it might be to turn the lamp on. So I hope it's just made it a little bit more atmospheric for you. Thank you so much for joining me for today's video. As I mentioned, I'm not very well and didn't have a lot of energy, so doing something like this, which is very much my forte and passion, talking about books, sharing books, was a nice one to do while I'm getting over this cold. So I hope you've enjoyed the books that I've showcased for you today. Let me know in the comments what you're currently reading. Let me know anything you would suggest based on what I've read so far this year. And let me know if I've inspired you to read